Welcome to Why Is This Good, a podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
All right, so it's my turn, and I've gotten really lucky the last couple months here. I feel like getting a story sent in by a listener, so I don't have to do
People
the hard work
suggesting
of,
stories.
yeah. I'm like, oh, that sounds good.
I miss Rob for that because people bring stories we would not find and we would not
No,
bring
they just like
because
have different like
not on our
tastes
radar.
and yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is one of those. It's called The Enormous Radio by John Cheever, and he did The Swimmer, right?
Yes, the swimmer that we read a long time ago.
Long time ago,
I
yeah.
think this story was originally published in the New Yorker and then wound up in a collection.
It says it first appeared in the New Yorker in 1947, subsequently
47.
collected in short stories. So the version that I shared with you, I kind of noticed as I was reading has like some weird typos and stuff. You know, it's like one of those ones that's been like adapted
Oh
from
yeah.
something.
When I see PDFs that look like that, I don't like them. So I looked for a different PDF and it
Yeah, so you
was
probably have a way different version.
scanned out of a book. It was
Okay.
scanned out of the Norton Anthology of Short Fiction.
Okay. Well, make sure that that's the one that we share. The Westcotts were going out for dinner that night, and when Jim came home, Irene was dressing. She seemed sad and vague, and he brought her a drink. They were dining with their friends in the neighborhood, and they walked to where they were going. The sky was broad and filled with light. It was one of those splendid spring evenings that excite memory and desire, and the air that touched their hands and faces felt very soft. A Salvation Army band was on the corner playing Jesus is Sweeter. Irene drew her husband's arm and held him there for a minute to hear the music. They are really such nice people, aren't they? She said. They have such nice faces. Actually, they're so much nicer than a lot of the people we know. She took a bill from her purse and walked over and dropped it into the tambourine. There was in her face, when she returned to her husband, a look of radiant melancholy that he was not familiar with, and her conduct at the dinner party that night seemed strange to him too. She interrupted her hostess rudely and stared at the people across the table from her with an intensity for which she would have punished her children. It was still mild when they walked home from the party, and Irene looked up at the spring stars. How far the little candle throws its beams, she exclaimed. So shines a good deed in a naughty world. She waited that night until Jim had fallen asleep and then went out into the living room and turned on the radio. Jim came home at about 6 the next night. Emma the maid let him in, and he had taken off his hat and was taking off his coat when Irene ran into the hall. Her face was shining with tears and her hair was disordered. Go up to 16C, Jim, she screamed. Don't take off your coat. Go up to 16C. Mr. Osborne's beating his wife. They've been quarreling since 4 o'clock and now he is hitting her. Go up there and stop him. From the radio in the living room, Jim heard screams, obscenities, and thuds. You know you don't have to listen to this sort of thing, he said. He strode into the living room and turned the switch. It's indecent, he said. It's like looking into windows. You know you don't have to listen to this sort of thing. You can turn it off. Oh, it's so terrible. It's so dreadful. Irene was sobbing. I've been listening all day and it's so depressing. Well, if it's so depressing, why do you listen to it? I brought this damned radio to give you some pleasure, he said. I paid a great deal of money for it. I thought it might make you happy. I wanted to make you happy. Don't quarrel with me, she moaned and laid her head on his shoulder. All the others have been quarreling all day. Everybody's been quarreling. They're all worried about money. Mrs. Hutchinson's mother is dying of cancer in Florida and they don't have enough money to send her to the Mayo Clinic. At least Mr. Hutchinson says they don't have enough money. And some woman in this building is having an affair with the handyman, with that hideous handyman. It's too disgusting. And Mrs. Melville has heart trouble and Mr. Hendricks is going to lose his job in April and Mrs. Hendricks is horrid about the whole thing and that girl that plays the Missouri Waltz is a whore, a common whore, and the elevator man has tuberculosis and Mr. Osborne has been beating his wife. She wailed, she trembled with grief and checked the stream of her tears down her face with the heel of her palm.
I want to ask you about some of that. Really near the end of where you read, Mr. Osborne has been beating his wife. My version says Mr. Osborne has been beating Mrs. Osborne.
Yeah, no, says his wife.
And then in the paragraph that's, well, if it's so depressing, why do you listen to it? You said, I brought this damned radio.
I should have said bought, yeah.
Okay, so that wasn't a typo. That was just, okay.
No, it does say brought. It does say brought. I thought I
It
just
does say
misspoke.
brought.
Yeah, I brought this damn radio to give you some pleasure. Yeah.
There's one more. There's a paragraph that starts, oh, it's so, you said terrible. Does it say terrible?
Yeah.
This one says, oh, it's so horrible. Those are some
This
changes.
is bad, yeah. They're like, let's translate this from English. What's another word for terrible? Horrible. Okay, well, lots of typos there. So yeah, like I said, this was suggested, so I hadn't read it, and I just saw Cheever, so I was like, I don't need to read it. I'll just send it. I'm sure it's good.
I was actually thinking, like the Grace Paley, I was thinking I should bring more Cheever because that's a name you hear all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm glad this was suggested.
What I liked about it by the end, and I don't know, it's probably like the most basic thing I can say about it, is that like a lot of this in the section that I read felt really applicable to today with social media and the news. And this was at a time in 1947 when radio radio was your medium that you could listen to all day, right? We didn't have 24/7 even cable news at that point. Like the TV would end and the radio you could switch. So that was their technology. And then obviously like there's some weird like sci-fi element to this or something, or maybe it is just a weird glitch. Maybe he's not trying to fit it into a genre, but the idea that the radio is tuning into all of this is bizarre to them and wouldn't happen now. But it's a glimpse into what we all experience today, which is just an inundation of information that is private to other people that we're being exposed to. And at first, there's this scene where her and her husband, they kind of realize the power of this radio and they spend a night listening and they're laughing by the time they go to bed. Everything is so interesting and funny and, they feel like they're spying on people and there's like some giddy element to it. And then by the time we see the wife here, she's absorbed so much of it, most of it negative, that it's just overwhelming. And I feel like this relates to all the studies they do about kids these days, comparing themselves to other people, for better or for worse. But then also like the doom scrolling in news, where we're not meant as humans to absorb as much of this as we're confronted with and to care about it all equally. And to see Irene kind of like crumbling and falling apart. And the solution to her doesn't seem to be what her husband is suggesting. He's like, well, turn it off if you don't like it. She's like, I can turn it off, but how do I ignore what everyone in this building that I sort of know is going through? Like, I don't have to expose myself to it. I don't have to listen to it, but how do I like avoid their pain too, So I like that this felt relevant that way.
The story made me think of like this glimpse into like private lives, and it's in the 40s and it's in the New Yorker. So I'm thinking of J.D. Salinger. This seems to be the way to get into the New Yorker at the time, is to point out that these upper middle class New Yorkers have an interior life. This is J.D. Salinger's stuff does this, Cheever's stuff does this, and this is specifically like this story is like got a fantasy story to it, or fantasy element,
Yeah,
fantasy
something.
science fiction-y element, because radios don't do that. So the radio has to be this magical thing that allows this glimpse into private lives in order to fulfill what we're going to get out of the story, or what's going to impact Irene. But nowadays we just have the internet. You don't need the science fiction for it. You don't need the fantasy element, the magic. Oh, and because it's in the New Yorker, it's not fantasy, it's magical realism. You can't denigrate the New Yorker by calling it fantasy. She gets a glimpse into these private lives, and like you said, it changes her. The excuse of in the story is like he starts complaining about money because it was so expensive to buy the radio and then to repair it, and then she also hasn't paid off a couple of bills, so he starts yelling at her about this. And now they have the thing that they yell about behind closed doors that nobody else will know about, right? So that they start experiencing this private turmoil that's behind the scenes of their apparently idyllic upper middle class existence. So the glimpse into those things, exactly like you said, affects them by giving them that exact thing. She became so enamored of listening in on these things. Now she has it for herself. She doesn't need the radio anymore.
Yeah, now she actually has a problem with her husband that was otherwise like they were humming along. Yeah, and maybe it's not just like a surface level argument either. It like kind of speaks to their approaches to life, It's like if her husband was telling her, well, if politics makes you sad, don't watch news about the war, you know what I mean? And it's like, well, I can't ignore this, Jim. Like it is a little deeper than just the radio, right? The radio is just like the method through which they're having this argument now.
I mean, it's a sign of the times, probably as well, or commentary on them, intentional or not, that Jim's reaction isn't, oh my God, he's beating her. It's, you don't have to listen to that sort of thing.
Yeah, he's like, obviously things like this are happening. Like, what does it matter to you?
Yeah. And it's indecent. He says it's indecent, but he's not talking about the beating, the listening in. He compares it to looking in window. You don't have to listen to this sort of thing. You can turn it off. Don't look in the windows. He admonishes her just for peeking, not for airing.
And then by the end, though, that kind of starts their confrontation. And then she becomes obsessed with this idea that other people, like in the building, can also hear them arguing about just listening to the radio. But then, like, by the end, the conflicts that they're talking about are like Jim is like airing all of her dirty laundry. He's like, you stole your mother's jewelry.
Yeah.
You never gave your sister any of that money. Yeah, you got an abortion. He says, where's all your piety and your virtue when you went to that abortionist? I'll never forget how cold you were and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, oh, wow. So they do have things that they just don't speak about. But also, he's kind of thinking to himself, yourself? Why do you suddenly care about other people's grief when you've kind of sailed through life doing horrible things yourself? And then I love how it ends because I think about this a lot too. She kind of messes with the radio, and instead of hearing other people in the building, it says the voice on the radio was suave and non-committal. An early morning railroad disaster in Tokyo, the loudspeaker said, killed 29 people. A fire in a Catholic hospital near Buffalo for the care of blind children was extinguished early this morning by nuns. The temperature is 47, the humidity is 89. And it just kind of like ends that way. At least for me, the way I'm interpreting this too is like there are degrees of separation between tragedies where it's easy to kind of say that this fire happened to someone else in a different town.
Yeah, it's far away.
Yeah, like literally, like this is geographic. So, an early morning railroad disaster in Tokyo, I think for a lot of people, there's like, oh my God, 29 people died. Like, that's in Tokyo, first of all. But like, I don't know anyone from Tokyo.
Other
It's
side of
that
the
far
world.
away. There's 29 of them, but like, who cares? The next story is a little closer. It's in Buffalo, but not just that. It was in a Catholic hospital. Oh God. So, if you're Catholic, that feels
Yeah.
closer to you. And then it's for the care of children, not just children, but blind children. And it's like, there's all these degrees.
What's interesting about that final moment is that while she's standing in front of the radio, Jim's outside the door still yelling at her about money and everything that's wrong with them. So that's the last paragraph. That's what we're left with. We don't get her reaction. She doesn't then go on to say she thought of those little children and was very sad. But we as readers get to confront that dichotomy of like their private conflict and the tragedy out in the world. It's an interesting contrast with like when they first discovered this was a glimpse into their neighbors. They said the Westcotts overheard that evening a monologue on salmon fishing in Canada, a bridge
Yeah.
game, running comments on home movies of what had apparently been a fortnight at Sea Island, and a bitter family quarrel about an overdraft at the bank. A bitter family quarrel. Like, that sounds familiar. What's going to happen later? They turned off their radio at midnight and went to bed weak with laughter. So how are they reacting to listening in on all this stuff? They're laughing at their neighbors. It's an amusement. They're not connecting with it at all at that moment.
Yeah, they're not connecting with it, and maybe it's easier to stomach the bit about the quarrel when it comes on the heels of this Alaskan fishing trip, right?
Maybe.
Like to hear about the good and the bad things versus like
Yeah.
to hear the deluge of the bad things. And there's like a novelty to it at first too, that like
Yeah.
all of this is like new and exciting. It hasn't worn them down yet. And I imagine like this story could have taken a different turn where everything that they heard from everyone else was so positive that it made their life feel less than, right? Which is like
That's right.
what they're showing in studies social media does to not just teen girls, but people like me too. Where you're like looking at everyone's like perfect little lives. They all have more money and they all have Botox and they're all happy, right? And obviously we know that that's not true, but it doesn't matter when you're consuming it at such a high rate, your brain tells you something else. This feels like very ahead of its time in the sense that radio technology aside, that not only could you envision a time and a place in which we would have access to this kind of private information, like as a voyeur or like in a curated way, either way. But then it seems ahead of its time to then also guess at what that would do to like your mental state. He's like, imagine if you could hear everyone talking about all the bad stuff. God, that would be awful.
Yeah, it is an interesting that he would, how many years prior to the internet, that would be the conclusion. This story reminds me so much of like a lot of those. We read that Button story, Matheson.
Oh yeah, yeah. That one or the Velvet, whatever.
The Velt,
The
yeah.
Velvet.
Ray Bradbury. But these kind of like, they're not quite, they're post golden era. There's like golden era, silver era.
Oh,
There's
okay.
like different eras of science fiction. But whatever era of science fiction it was, it feels kind of like that, where it's like you get this like neat premise of something that's magical, scientific, whatever. Radio can tune in the sounds in the building, the nearby sounds, and then you start to realize it's your neighbors. That's a bit of magic or pseudoscience if it's a science fiction kind of thing. But in using that premise to explore a psychological development within a character, it seemed, yeah, ahead of a time. Like a lot of the science fiction at the time, it's predictive, right? It's predictive of what would happen if we had this capacity. And there's no reason to believe that anyone would think that, 50 years later, you would have that capacity to glimpse your neighbors' private lives in this way. So it's not truly predictive.
I guess it's just like sometimes I think what we hear about technology is that it's changed us or something,
Yeah.
Oh, the technology is this own separate thing, but how you use it and what you feel about it is the problem. And it's like, I don't know, because these people feel the same thing, It wasn't hard for him to guess that this is human nature in a sense to react this way about these things. Like, is it my fault that when I log into Instagram and I see a funny meme, but then right afterwards I see something that like makes me feel something like this? this. Is that my fault? Am I consuming too much of it? Or is my brain as a human not built for this kind of exposure?
You hear often this refrain like human beings evolved to live in like the savannah or whatever, like the evolved in Africa, not to live in cities or not to live in all this situation. And it's true, like that we didn't develop in cities, but I always want to say, but our situation, like we are still human beings. We evolved in a social setting and we still have social settings. And that's the setting in which our brains and our psyche developed and for which it was shaped. So like social situations still have the same characteristics that they always did. And our brains are developed in order to handle the social situations. So we understand other people, we project and understand mental states within other people. Like that's why our eyes have sclera, like where you can see which way our eyes are pointed. So we know what we're each looking at. Other stuff like that. We are built to understand other people
Yeah.
because we are evolved to live in a social setting. And so you move that social setting out of the savannah and into a city, it's still a social setting. And I think this glimpse into the social setting within, like he's looking at the
Right.
social setting and the psychology, it's all still very fundamentally human. You could set a story like this in hunter-gatherer tribe.
Right.
You know, somebody is going around listening in at all the other tents or whatever they're living in. Or you could set it now with social media. Someone's just scrolling constantly and like how they're reacting to that. It's just getting a glimpse at what's the difference between public and private life.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And this is like sort of like off topic, but I was going to say something similar in terms of like when people these days say that they have like ADHD, my thought is always like, your brain's not broken. Like your brain is working the way it's supposed to work. It's like, but we weren't made to be exposed to this level of like information and especially in like these social settings, you know what I mean? So it's like, on the one hand, it's like, yes, this is a social setting in a different like sort of context. And so there's like certain like ways that we can expect we'll react or behave.
Things have sped up a lot.
Yeah, but then there's like this element to it where it's like social aspect aside, it's a lot to take in. So our brains are wired for like pleasure. If something's boring me, I swipe. And does that mean that I have ADHD or does it mean that like this is a platform with infinite options? So even here, there's like an element of that where when they have their original radio or when they're first using this one, I forget, when they're listening to things like you said of different people going on and on about different like trips or whatever, like I don't know, that's interesting at first, but then it becomes so rushed and so condensed. And I think too, given the opportunity, they wouldn't go back to listening to classical music, knowing that this other thing is out here. So like she might still be able to tune into like a news radio show if she wanted to. She might be able to tune into like the traditional radio, but like her brain now is primed to want this other thing, even though it feels bad. Yeah, so I don't know. That's interesting too to have sort of predicted that. Because by the end she's fiddling with it. She goes back to the normal radio. And she even says his voice is cold and non-committal, suave and non-committal. Even that doesn't like tickle us as much.
It's a newscaster's voice, right? Just reading the headlines.
Yeah, it's like, do you want to hear your friend tell you gossip or do you want to hear a newscaster? You want to hear your friend like, listen to this. I don't know. I thought it felt very relevant to today, which is, I think, what I liked most about it. And then there's probably a very similar, like, sort of storytelling aspect to this in, like, The Veldt, where it starts out as this innocuous technology that's, like, new and exciting and foreign to them and completely harmless. And all of these stories just sort of, like, progressively make it worse until it, like, illuminates something, like, deep within the characters that was there all along. So, like, in The Veldt, the kids are like, the parents are ruining this for us. It doesn't mean that they're like psychopathic children, but like the thing that was always present in the kids is the parents are getting in the way of our pleasure, of our immediate fun. They're the ones setting the rules, so we got to do something about that, right? Whether that means like keeping a light on in your bedroom so you can read late into the night or sneaking out of the house. In this case, it's let's feed our parents to the lions, which is extreme, but it illuminates some aspect of human nature. And I like how these stories are kind of like predictable that way. Like as soon as I started reading this and realized that the radio was doing weird things, it was really easy to sort of know how the rest of this was going to play out. Even if I didn't know like what the takeaway might have been, there's like an element to how these are told.
I like the way it developed. I had never read this and I didn't know what it was going to be before I read it the first time. And I was like, what is happening? It's called The Enormous Radio. So you know that there's going to be a radio and you know that it's going to play a part in the story. But when it's like something's wrong with it, it's tuning into bells. I didn't get that it was like literally broadcasting the sounds of the elevator the first time I read it because it was described as interference. So I was thinking of static, but I like the way that it just slowly developed to like you kind of discovered what was happening with the characters.
Yeah, I think in a lot of stories, like there's something like that here, except for maybe the Velt, where they had been familiar with that technology for a while, and we're like dropping
Yeah.
in to where it like goes off the rails,
Yeah.
like the point at which it starts acting weird.
Like we bought this for the kids. We knew what it was when we had it installed.
But I think whether or not you want to call it, like you sort of mentioned, like fantasy or like sci-fi or whatever it is, like this could just be like a glitch, right? I don't know what Cheever was thinking of when he conceived of this, because it does sort of get introduced as a way where it's like, there's something weird with this radio. It seems to be tuning into our neighbors instead of this, right? Not that this is how the radio is supposed to work, but like it's broken or it's too powerful or whatever it is. So I don't know like what his idea was in terms of a genre.
Yeah, I think what I should have said when I was saying that earlier was that it's a fantastical element
Yeah.
because it's magic. Like this is not a thing that radios actually do. So you introduce some magic to it, but he uses that to explore the psychology of the characters. So I think they started calling that elevated fantasy recently, where you have a fantasy land that is interested in the people who live in the fantasy land and their interior lives. And that's what he's interested in, is the interior lives of people who live in New York.
Right.
But you contrast that with what is traditional fantasy, which is the interior lives come to life in the fantasy land. Like you go into a fantasy land that is your interior life. So you meet, your whatever psychological problems out in the world. So there's a distinction between those two things. So I don't think it's like generically, it's not a fantasy story.
Yeah.
It's using fantastical element, which is probably why they would call it magical realism.
Okay, sure.
I joke and say the New Yorker would never publish fantasy. That's why they call it magical realism. But that is part of why they call it magical realism.
That makes sense.
Although nowadays the distinctions are getting weird because the fantasy genre in general has introduced this concept of elevated fantasy, which is, like I said, more about character interiority, being inside, being actually interior.
Right. I guess all I was getting at was like as a takeaway, the idea that like whether you want to go down a genre like that or like you said, introduce something like an element of magical realism to like a current technology, this is like a really easy path to sort of like follow developmentally. Like what happens when this intending consequence like goes off the rails. Like sometimes I think people that don't normally write in these kinds of genres think that they can't conceive of a concept that would fit it. But like we've talked about a lot of times, it's sci-fi and fantasy. Sci-fi specifically seems to ask the question like, what if? What if this happened like next or whatever? Fantasy is like maybe you're inventing like all the rules. Magic realism is like maybe there's no scientific explanation for this, right? So we just call it something else, whatever it is.
The Paper Tigers story, I feel like, is like exemplar of magical realism.
Right. So I like the idea that this almost reads like what a modern day version would be for like, what's that Netflix TV show? It's individual episodes. Black Mirror. I think they have like a current like eighth season or something. They each have like 10 episodes and each one is like this individual thing and it asks the question of like a current technology. And I think it's really easy to think about it that way. Like, what if XYZ? What if your phone accidentally did this? Like, what if your computer started acting wonky and did this? I don't know. I just think it's like a cool jumping off point. That's kind of like my takeaway. Having read, I feel like a handful of these now where I feel like they kind of progress the same way. It's an easy way to kind of get into a genre like that if you wanted to.
Yeah, the what if question. I think you can apply a what if question to almost anything.
Yeah.
But
I guess it's kind of like what if it went wrong?
Science fiction's more
This
like
particular technology.
What if technology went farther than we can right now and allowed us to access something? But my takeaway is kind of similar. But I was thinking about this, like I said before, this feels very similar to what J.D. Salinger is doing. So I was thinking about it in terms of comparing how this story, this Cheever story, is getting at the inner psychology of a character versus how J.D. Salinger is getting at the inner psychology of a character. In his, you don't even present, like when we read Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut, we don't get any interiority. We don't know what she's thinking at any moment. We can glimpse what she's going through by how she's acting. We see her react to her daughter and freak out on her because she's doing a thing that her daughter is doing a thing that she recognizes as something she regrets. But we infer all that based on how she's acting. Whereas this one is like, what if I introduce like a device, a literal in the story device, a concrete device, or a literary device that allows a glimpse at something, and how does the character respond to that? But each are getting at the psychology, and they're showing us that people are more complicated than they appear on the surface. Salinger's A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. It's like, present this guy doing these things, and then what happens at the end makes you say, whoa, what happened? Why did he do that? And you have to go back and think about how he got there. Anyway, so this is like different ways of approaching a similar problem in fiction. How can you highlight what you're trying to get at in your story? Like we talked about in a previous episode about capturing a feeling. You can do that by just presenting human beings at surface level and watching them do things and glimpsing those feelings. Or you can do it by introducing a fantastical device that allows you to like really dive into something, which is your takeaway. Like use that device to do it.
Right.
But I think ultimately the story is always coming back to what you're looking at, which is finding out more about people. The story is always about learning about the people.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know if that's a concrete takeaway. That was just my thoughts when I was thinking about it, like how to accomplish that, the thing that fiction accomplishes. And there's so many different ways. We've read so many different stories, and there's always there's patterns, but there's so many different ways to dive into things.
Right. Maybe there is something similar to The Swimmer, where he's swimming through every backyard and he sees every person's little life in a moment there.
Yeah. And that one, I don't think I thought about it at the time we read it, but what I said earlier about fantasy being about if you encounter your interiority outside in the world, in a lot of ways, he's going through his past. Each pool is like encountering some aspect of his past, right? Cheever's, I didn't realize, was playing with genre so interestingly. I should read more of his stuff.
Yeah, like, I don't know, there could be something similar there, some theme of his. But yeah, if you guys are listening and have a story suggestion that we haven't come across, send it in, because these are really fun. Like John said, they're either not on our radar or they're not stories that we would know how to find otherwise. And I don't like looking.
We've done so many episodes, we've exhausted the first page of the Google results.
Truly, I feel that way. All right, thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.